So there seems to be a lot of confusion in the knife community when it comes to the Cold Steel Triad Lock. And first up I want to say there's a video out there here on YouTube from neroknives. I will leave you the link down in the description box. It is a really good video. You should absolutely take the time to watch this video. He talks about why the Cold Steel Triad Lock is not as strong as you may think. And I will reference to that video a little bit here. And I really want to talk about why the Triad Lock, or why I like the Triad Lock and where it is really good. So essentially, when you look at the Triad Lock, you know, we all know we have that additional pin here in on the back locking system, and that lock bar is also deeper into that notch, into that cutout here. This is also why you need to press that lock bar, you know, further down in order to disengage that knife. We'll get to that a little bit later. And what this essentially does is it keeps the knife from folding when you put pressure on the spine side of the knife. It keeps the knife from folding on your hands. Where does something like this make sense? You know, for example, if you do baton a folding knife for whatever reason, we will get to that at the end of this video, when it makes sense to baton a folding knife, for example. But there are a couple of other things that come with that, you know, feature of the Triad Lock to lock up that securely and to keep that, you know, lock bar to come out of that notch too easily. So first up, the Triad Lock is a really self-adjusting locking system. What do I mean by that? For example, if you do use your knife, essentially you will develop blade play. So most pocket knives already have blade play from the beginning. But of course, if the tolerances are good, build quality and everything is good, if your pivot is at the right position and everything, usually you should have at least side to side and up and down blade play as possible. Of course, most pocket knives have ever so slightly side to side a blade play. Of course, that has to do, you know, with the contact area the blade has inside the handle. So the size of the washer matters, and the size of the part of the blade that is going into the handle. You know, those are your contact areas inside the knife. And you know, for example, it's always difficult, I think, to bring up Chris Reeve in a Cold Steel video, but I will do it anyway. Chris Reeve knives usually have, you know, really big washers and quite a big part of the blade going into the handle, so they have a lot of contact area, so therefore they have as least side to side blade play as pocket knives essentially can get, I think. And so back to the Triad Lock. When you do use your blade, and it will eventually develop blade play, any knife will do that, and naturally you go on and adjust your pivot. But the good thing about the Triad Lock is when you open and close it a couple of times, what happens is that lock bar here sinks deeper into that notch, into that cutout here, and therefore eliminating that blade play again, meaning that lock bursts in and becomes more securely as you use it. And so you don't always need to adjust your pivot to get your knife back where it should be. So that's the biggest thing I like about the Triad Lock. It's just a self-adjusting locking system, and all locking systems in a kind of way do this. For example, if you have a frame lock, when a frame lock wears over the time, you know, maybe your frame lock starts up right here, which I'm not really a big fan of frame locks that lock up too early, we'll get to that. And over the time it travels over to this side, locking up more securely. It will wear in, which is a good thing because your knife becomes more secure over time and it will not fold as easily on your fingers. So a lot of people say that the Triad Lock is easy to open, but it's really annoying to close. And to those people I want to say, any pocket knife needs to be worn in. The pocket knives that already come worn in, you know, someone at the factory took the time to break it in, but naturally you need to do it. For example, when I got my Spyderco Paramilitary 2, it needed a couple of weeks to break in and become smooth and everything. Any pocket knife needs that breaking period, and so do Triad Lock need that breaking period. So first up, that spring in here, you know, the tension of the spring needs to soften up a little bit over time. Naturally, it takes about a week for me to break in one of my cold steel knives when I get a new one. So that spring, the spring tension needs to soften up a little bit. And also, for example, on the cold steel knives that are coated, these days they use DLC coat on the blade, but they use Teflon still on the lock bar. I always take my new pocket knives, cold steel knives apart and sand down the coating here on that lock bar to reduce, you know, because the coating will wear off anyways. So I'll also want to reduce friction, and I also usually sand the coating away. This one of course doesn't have coating on it anyway. I usually sand off the coating where that spring contacts the lock bar. Now essentially what that does, some people say, you know, cold steels, they have a stickiness to it on the lock bar. For example, you can probably hear it on this Voyager. Can you hear this? So this lock is still extremely sticky here, but this is not necessarily a bad thing to have a little bit of stickiness on the lock, because what it essentially does, it keeps the knife from folding. That stickiness on the lock bar is not a bad thing. It's just not as enjoyable to use when you open and close your knife all the time, but it actually makes the knife more secure. I remove the coating anywhere because it will, you know, wear off by itself. And I still think this knife is extremely secure without having that stickiness. So, for example, frame locks. People build, I think this was one of the reasons people used titanium on frame locks, is because titanium, when titanium contacts steel, it has a little bit of stickiness. This one of course doesn't have it, but some titanium frame locks, especially the older ones, the first ones that came out back in the days, you know, they had a lot of lock stick. And this is not a bad thing, because it keeps the knife it keeps the lock bar, you know, from moving to this side and from disengaging and accidentally closing on you. So stickiness on the lock bar is not a bad thing. For example, this is of course not an Amazon, but I will use this as an example because I don't have an Amazon. But Emerson knives, for example, they use titanium on the locking side of their liner locks and stainless steel on the non-locking side. And the reason they do it, and also the reason why Amazons have so much lock stick, I think they're still are doing this with the titanium on the locking side. The reason they're doing this, the reason they have lock stick, is because they want that knife to be more secure. They want that lock to be a little bit sticky. So when you get a new cold steel knife, you need to break it in. That stickiness will be gone over the time, and also that spring will soften up a little bit, and also your finger will develop the strength to push down that lock bar a little bit further. For example, here's a Spyderco Endura. You don't have to, on other backlock knives, you don't have to depress that lock bar as much as on a Triad Lock. So you need a little bit of thumb strength, and you need a little bit of time to develop that motor skills, like with anything, guys. And look, for example, can you see how this blade bounces off my finger? This is an extremely smooth knife. And of course it had a couple of years time to break in. But this is a good example of how a Triad Lock should be. There is your blade centering, everything is nice and perfect. Secure lockup and everything. So, self-adjusting. If you do use your knife and it develops blade play, the Triad Lock self-adjusts it when opening and closing a couple of times without you needing to turn the pivot. Of course, you can also do that. And for example, if you do some prying, prior to this video, I pried out some nails from this really nasty hard dried out wood. And of course, the knife developed blade play, and I opened and closed it a couple of times, and the blade plate was gone. This is where the Triad Lock shines. neroknives in this video mentions that the Cold Steel Triad Lock doesn't have a strength in this way, so side to side. So for example, when you pry, cold steel knives are not as strong as knives, for example, that have a bigger pivot, external stop hands, and all that stuff. And I totally agree to that. Cold steel knives are strong when it comes to actually the knife keeping it from folding on your hand, so pressure from this side, but not side to side. But you don't really need it. I could pry out these nails with this one, and this is, you know, this is a very thin and delicate tip. I try to focus here, but the Recon One clip-on, here's a Tanto. This has a little bit stronger tip, at least back here, not at the very end of the tip. But let's compare it to a paramilitary 2, so you can, for those who don't know how the tip of a Recon One clip-on looks like, you know, it is the Recon One has a thin and delicate tip, but you can still pry with it, because you have, one of the benefits of having a hollow grind is that you have a shoulder up here, and that shoulder is very strong. So you don't pry with this part right here, you pry with this. Of course you lose a little bit of leverage, but you can still do it. You can pry with this knife if you do it correctly and carefully. And of course that tip is also not as flimsy as you might think. It has nothing to do with the Triad Lock right now. I'm sorry, I'm getting off topic, but I just want to mention that as we're talking about prying, the tip is not as flimsy as you may think, because it is supported by a swedge, and the swedge gives the tip a little bit more strength. Unlike if you, for example, have a flat grind, there is no swedge. That tips like this can be broken very easily, because there is, you know, no additional, you know, rounding that helps to support that tip. So also a thing, you know, if you do pry, for example, with a flat grind, naturally they would, you know, depends how and why, how and what you're prying, you know, naturally they would break like here, at least on this knife. But you know, if you have hollow grind, for example, you know, you have that shoulder strength running all the way back here, so there is a little bit, you know, less from keeping this knife from prying, from breaking right here. We really get off topic, I'm sorry. So the next thing I want to say, so the Cold Steel Triad Lock is adequately strong for doing prying. Could it be stronger? Yes. Would I wish that these had bigger pivots and maybe bigger washers? Yes, that would be a cool thing, but it is not really necessary, at least for me and my uses. And the hardest thing I'm gonna put pressure side to side is when prying out nails, and I'm being very careful with it, and I had never had a problem, never had a cold steel knife break on me. But of course there are stronger knives to do that kind of stuff. The thing is, with the Triad Lock you get a very, you know, a rather inexpensive way of manufacturing. You manufacture all the parts, you don't have, you know, an overcomplicated mechanism, and of course that leads to, you can keep the price down for your end consumer, which is a good thing, right? Cold steel knives have good prices for their performance. That's one of the things that we all love about them. And also, these knives are simple to take apart. They are really simple in maintenance. I have never had a problem with a cold steel knife, taking it apart and putting it back together. For example, Spyderco Endura again. Spyderco backlock systems, sometimes they use, in some of the backlock systems, they use FRN or plastic, you know, backspacers. And essentially what that means is that this part, because any backlock system kind of looks like this inside, this part right here on some Spyderco knives is out of plastic, meaning, and I have seen this, and it has happened to me, that this part right here can break when you're trying to reassemble that knife, because that spring tension is too much for that plastic part to hold it. Cold Steel usually builds their backspacers out of aluminium, which is much stronger, and they also use a stainless pin instead of a plastic pin, you know, to support that part right here from the spring tension from not breaking it. So this is a much more solid internal construction. It's much more easy to reassemble it, because, you know, Spyderco knives, they usually use liners inside. There's nothing wrong with that. I have no problem with that at all. It keeps, you know, makes the handle strong, but it's a little bit more fiddling to get a Spyderco back lock knife back together when you have reassembled it. in comparison to a triad lock. Of course, some of these Spyderco knives, you know, they come with stainless steel backspacers on the lock back systems. So it's not the case with all of the Spyderco knives. And I really want to say this, I have nothing against the Enduro. The Enduro is a fantastic knife, but that is the big weakness with the Enduro, having that plastic backspacer and being not so simple to, you know, reassembly this knife. Also want to mention, and this is true for all backlock systems, not just for the Triad Lock, but you can, with a backlock system, you can build a much thinner constructed handle. Which is, you know, it can be a good and a bad thing depending however you see it. For example, you know, thin knives are easier. Of course, I couldn't put it all the way. Thinner knives are easier to carry, you know. But of course, they become a little bit more uncomfortable rather fast if you're, you know, using them for an extended period of time. Blah, 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 blah. So, but I have to say this is one of the benefits of having a backlock system, you know. You can build a thinner knife handle, which can be a good or a bad thing, however you see it. So we talked about self-adjustment. We talked about, you know, breaking period, lock stick and all the maintenance, thinner handles. Cheaper way of manufacturing a knife, which keeps the price down for the end user. Always a good thing. It's probably also why they use smaller pivots and not really large pivots, like for example Chris Reeve does. Larger pivots naturally, you know, cost more. You know, makes sense, right? So we talked about that side-to-side strength, where I think that Cold Steel really has enough of that side-to-side strength, and you know, I personally don't need more side-to-side strength than this. But of course, there is a stronger way of building a knife, you know, for prying and stuff like that. But even with, like I said, even with a delicate tip knife, which most Cold Steel knives give you, you know, rather delicate tip. Even here on the Cold Steel Recon Tanto, you can see that very end of the tip is still rather fine. And then a little bit further back, you have a strong tip, which is good. You can do you can open zip ties and stuff like that. You can do your fine tip work, but you can still pry with this part back here, and so can you do it with, for example, a clip point version. You have your fine your fine task here, and then you have your harder tasks back here. And of course, use common sense. Be careful what you do, and you will not break the knife. So up and down strength. I said at the beginning, I want to talk about where this makes sense. And I also want to say, I'm not a big fan of Cold Steel's, you know, proof tests where they show how much weight you can hang off one of their knives, because I don't think they are realistic at all. Because in what kind of situation in your life do you need to be in to hang weight off your handle? It's of course just to show, you know, the strength of that locking system, but please don't say Cold Steel knives are so good because you can hang 200 pounds from a knife handle, and you cannot do this with, you know, let's say Chris Reeve and Cozy or something like that. It's not realistic. You will not be doing this in real life. But what you will be doing, probably, or hopefully not, is you may have been in a situation where you need to baton with a folding knife. I'm absolutely against batoning folding knives, but if you had to, just do it. And I personally have done it just for fun to see how much a locking system can do. And what naturally happens is that locking system wears in, or wears I should say. So Triad locks, if you baton them, that lock bar just sinks deeper into that notch, making it even more secure. Such as a frame lock. If you do baton a frame lock it can also pop out this way if it's a bad frame lock, but if it's a good frame lock, it will whir this way, making it also more secure, giving you more contact area. Same with the liner lock, you know. The liner lock essentially will also travel to this side or pop out this way, which you don't want. So when batoning, when should you baton a knife? In an emergency situation, that's the only reason why you should baton a knife. And then I would also recommend you, if you can, baton it like this, so you don't put any pressure on the locking system. But for example, imagine it's winter, you drive a road on the countryside, there is nothing there, no houses, no no other cars, nothing, and you get off the road and you drive directly into an ice lake. Now you're completely wet, you have no cell phone, or you have no phone connection, and or maybe your phone is wet, you only have, you know, maybe a lighter, you get a couple of sparks still out of it, and you have a pocket knife. Maybe in this kind of situation where you lose your fine motor skills from that cold water, you maybe need to rely on a knife to, you know, get a fire going and something like that. And naturally in winter, when it's really cold, you know, wood will be frozen, so you need to split that wood somehow to get to the dry part on the inside, because the outside is still wet and frozen. So that's where you maybe need to baton a knife. And that's where I would rather have a triad lock than anything else, because that's where it really shines. You can absolutely, you know, I'm not saying that you should baton a triad lock through frozen wood. It's absolutely dangerous. You can break the knife, you can hurt yourself, you can be in a lot more trouble than you were in the first place. But if you use common sense, if you know what you're doing, if you experienced a little bit in the outdoors and know, you know, what kind of wood to use, you know, don't baton through a really thick piece of wood with a lot of knots, then you will be completely fine, I guess. So yes, this is everything I have to say about the Cold Steel Triad Lock and why I really like it. Like I said, please watch the video from neroknives. I really agree with him, but I also, you know, like I said, I made my argument there. If you disagree with anything that I say, that's completely fine, you know. Just make a good argument why you disagree with me, and, you know, whatever. I like all kinds of knife. I'm not just a Cold Steel fanboy, but I use Cold Steel knives on a day-to-day basis, and I really like the Triad Lock, you know, for everything that I just said. So I think I'm getting off topic, so we'll end this video right here. I think I covered everything. Yeah, thank you guys for watching, and have yourself a nice day, people. Goodbye.